Again, and welcome to the Combined Funders 2016 Annual Report Training. My name is Cheryl Cohen with the City of Seattle Office of Housing, and today I'm joined by
Lana Calip from the Washington State Housing Finance Commission.
And Justin Bombera from the Office of Housing.
So today, the first session, Getting Started 101, will run from 8:30 to 11. Following that, we'll have a home mini training from 11 a.m. to noon. And we'll end this afternoon with the Digging Deeper 201 from 1 o'clock to 3 p.m. There are a number of funders that are currently using the web-based annual reporting system. And those include the Washington State Housing Finance Commission, the City of Seattle, King County, State Commerce, City of Tacoma, Snohomish County, City of Spokane, and City of Bellingham. So WebBARS users, the information you give us is really valuable to us, and we really want to stress that. We acknowledge that we're asking a lot from you to report all of this information to us, and we're always in the process of trying to improve the user functions of WebBARS and provide the best sort of technical assistance that we can. So we're always open to feedback, but again, we appreciate the information that you give us and are committed to making sure that everything is accurate, and we want to help you succeed in those goals. So typically in an in-person webinar or an in-person training, we would ask the audience, what role do you play at your organization and which funders do you report to? So we don't have the opportunity to do that interactively in a webinar, but perhaps you're a property manager, or you work in a compliance leasing office, or you're an owner who submits reports. So we hope that these trainings will be beneficial to you regardless of what role you play at your organization. And as a reminder, if you have home funds in your property, please join us for the special home mini training from 11 a.m. to noon. So currently, all of the participants should have received all of the handouts for the home training as well as the afternoon Digging Deeper session via email. The home materials and the matrix for supplemental annual reporting is currently available in the webinar. The 5 handouts you should see on your webinar bar. But again, you should have also received them via email. To get the most out of today's training, we strongly suggest that you will have read the user guide. It's available on the Finance Commission website. We acknowledge it's a pretty dry, unexciting read, but it does have a lot of really useful information, and you can get a lot of your questions answered by simply going through the user guide. It's also a great tool if you're not wanting to read it front to back. You could just open it up and do a fine search to see if there's some information to answer a specific question you have. In addition, you'll need to have a WebBARS user ID and password. So just to go through the agenda today, the 101, and I'm going to hand it over to Lana Calip, and she's going to go through the first several items around WebBARS in Table 1, and then I'll come back and do a little bit on Tables 2 and 3, and we'll have time for some questions and some one-on-one assistance, and then we'll take a little break and move into the home mini portion of the training. So Lana Calip. Oh, one more slide. We'll get to that later. Here.
So I am going to switch over, and we are going to take a look at the web-based annual reporting system. Some people call it WBARS, WebBARS, WBARS, whatever you call it. This is typically what it looks like when you go in, although you will not have this bar that I have up here at the top. Today we're working from a training site, and so all of the information on the site has been generalized. So instead of seeing property names, we're going to see projects with numbers after them. And instead of seeing residence names, we're going to see resident 36052, that sort of information, since I am using an actual property management company's information, and we will be looking at an actual property. So except for this bar at the top, which I will move up the screen so we're not seeing, the rest of this training site approximates what you see on the live site. I am currently logged in under the strange user number, and under that login, I am someone who is set up in the property manager role for this property. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. So just taking the page from the top and telling you what's here. First off, this is a quick and easy way to click into your organization, and I can just click on, normally it would say the name of your company here, but if I click on that organization, and this will happen, you will time out in the system if you sit idle too long, so I am just logging back in. The timeout for the actual live site, I believe, is set at 1 hour. So if you've been sitting idle for an hour, on this training site, it's much shorter. So that is why I had to log back in. But when you click on your organization, you'll see your organization's name and the type as you've been set up. This company is a contractor owner and a property management company, so both boxes are checked for this company. And then you'll see all of the users that have been set up with IDs and passwords for the company. So for this particular management company, there's 23 records, which means they have 23 users. The users that have this shield-looking icon next to them, these are the organization administrators for this organization. These are the people that can add new users, so give new users an ID and a password, and then they're also the ones that can assign users into the different roles at the property so that the correct users can get edit rights on the tables. If you are an organization administrator and you need to set someone up, from this screen, by clicking the New button, which I'm doing right now, you have the opportunity to set up a new user, giving them an ID and a password. It's important that when you set someone up, you go down to this organization area and you give them the proper credentials. So you can make someone else in your agency an organization administrator. There's no limit on how many user IDs within your organization can have this designation. It's totally up to the organization. We recommend that it's not just one person, because if it's just one person at an organization and that person leaves the organization, that means no one else will have the ability to go in and create any new IDs or passwords. So at least 2 is a good idea. You may want to limit it somewhat because you might not want excessive people having this organization administrator ability. Just might make it a little bit more difficult to manage the user IDs that are set up in your system. The second box talks about on-site manager. If when you set someone up, you're going to want them to be in the on-site manager role for properties, then you're going to want to click them to be an on-site manager here. If they're not going to be in the on-site manager role, let's say they're going to be in the property manager role or the owner role, do not click this checkbox, because if you click this checkbox for on-site manager, the only role you're going to be able to put them in for a property is an on-site manager role. As soon as you start clicking buttons, I don't know if you've noticed, it automatically clicked able to submit reports to next level. Pretty much anyone you set up in the system, you're going to want to give them this right. If they're ever going to go in and edit any tables and want to submit them forward, they would need this box checked in order to be able to do that. One other thing to mention here is that the organization administrator and the on-site boxes, those two are mutually exclusive. So if I check organization administrator, Might be a little hard to notice on your end, but then it lights out on-site manager. So I can't click them to be an on-site manager if they're an organization administrator and vice versa. Okay, so to set someone up, you'd put in their information, assign their roles, and then you would have to hit save. Since this is a web-based system, nothing is basically done in the system until you hit the save button. So you never want to navigate away from a page where you've made changes without hitting the save button. The other box on the screen, you'll see this active box. There's no way to delete users in the system, but you can deactivate them by unchecking the box. So if you have someone who's left your company, as long as you leave them active, they're going to be able to go in with their ID and password and potentially edit tables on your properties. So once somebody's no longer with your company, you want to go in and uncheck the active box and save. That way, they will no longer have access to your tables. Since I'm actually not setting anybody up right now, I'm going to hit the cancel screen. And that will take me back to the main organization screen. And if I cancel out of that, because I didn't make any changes, and then I want to navigate back to my projects page. When you're navigating in the system, you want to use this, what we call the breadcrumbs bar. We don't recommend that you use the browsers, the web browsers, the back arrow. That sometimes creates errors in the system. So you can go back by clicking on back, or you can go back by clicking on any of the pages where you've already been. So I'm going to hit projects, and this will take me back to my initial screen showing my organization and the projects that I have access to. Justin, any questions popped in on this section?
Not so far.
Okay, if you do have a question, remember you can type it in or raise your hand, and Justin will alert me that that's happened, and I will stop and answer the question. So next thing down, that was organization. Next thing down is in this blue bar, we have import here. And if at your management company you are already using a compliance software package where you are putting in your resident information, and instead of also entering it into WBARS, you would like to import, you can click that key like I did, and you're always going to get this warning. Please pay attention to this warning. When you actually go through the import process, it wipes out everything on the current year table 1 that you're working on. So at this point in time, if you've put in information for 2016 manually, and now you want to try to import, or you just hit the button and do it on accident, it will wipe out all the information for 2016 that you've put in, and there is no way for us to get that information back. Therefore, if you're considering importing, what you want to do is most likely, and you've been manually putting in information for the year, go ahead and go through your 2016 reporting period, finish it up manually, and then once we get into next year, you have your new table, then start experimenting with the import process where you don't have a lot of information to lose. So I'm going to hit OK to the warning and just show you that once you actually get to the import page and you've gone through the warning, under the documentation area, there are 2 separate files that can be pulled up. One is information for end users, which would be you. The second one is information for software software developers, and within that second document, that is where the XML schema is listed, and that's the technical information that your software developer for a system like Yardi or AMSI or Boston Post, it's how they have to link your information so that it imports correctly into WBARS. There are quite a few organizations that are doing the import process using some of those larger software programs that I just mentioned. There's also some, though, that are using smaller software, and they've gone through the process, and their developer has matched the schema. And sounds like we have a question?
Good question, actually. Is importing only for Table 1?
Yes, importing is only for Table 1 at this point. Most of the, or a lot of the information from Table 1 feeds directly into Table 2, and you'll see that when Cheryl shows us Table 2 and 3 later. I think some of the question on that might be, what about Table 4, the financial piece? And at this point in time, there is no way to import into Table 4. Okay? So in asking users, what I would consider some super users from large management companies with a really good technical grasp, I kind of asked them at what do you think the break-even point is, where it's worth the money with your developer, it's worth the time you put into learning how to import. And I was told by 3 different individuals that they thought about 2,000 units was the break-even point. So if you have less than that, it was their feeling that you might be better off continuing to manually input. But if you had more than 2,000 units, it would definitely be worth your time to figure out the import process. So, and then of course once you're working with it, then you had to import, you could go through and do the process. I'm going to back up and go to my projects page. And while we're doing that, we'll just pause and see if there's any other questions on the importing process. Not seeing any come in. So I'm going to move from that. There is this custom reports section. This is something, if you're interested in this, get a hold of one of your funders. It does have to be made available to you, and there is some different reporting that you can pull from this area, but it's not fully active yet. So then I'm going to come here to my view, and I am currently set on my projects, and that's the default for this screen. And what that means is the projects that I see, and I'm going to scroll my page up so you can see, there are currently 41 records, which means 41 projects listed on my screen. If I go to a different view, my organization, and I have to hit Apply Selection, and it'll take a moment to process. And this is probably a good time to mention that my training site is not run on the same servers and so as the live site, so my training site is a little slower. You'll see it takes a little longer to process than the live site does. If you notice, now there are 44 records instead of 41. The difference is when you do My Projects, you see projects where you are listed in one of the roles in the system for that property. And what I mean by that is there are 3 specific roles for each property, and one user ID can be set for each one of those roles. Cannot be multiple. And I like to think of it as a ladder system. And the bottom rung of the ladder is the on-site manager role. It doesn't mean the person that's in that role is actually the on-site manager, the person that is at the office every day talking to the residents. It's simply a role. A step up from that is property manager. Again, doesn't have to be the property manager. A lot of times it is the compliance specialist for the management company. And all of the tables start at the bottom of the ladder, so they all start at the on-site role level, and whoever is listed in that role is the person that has edit rights on the tables. They all start there until they are submitted. When they get submitted, they go up the ladder to the property manager role. Once they're at the property manager, the person listed in that role then has edit rights. They won't have edit rights if the table is not at their level. The property manager then submits up to the owner role, and the person in the owner role will never have the ability to edit on any of the tables. The person in the owner role can look at the tables. If they think a correction needs to be made, they can unsubmit the table or tables back to the property manager level for corrections. A property manager can also unsubmit down to the on-site level for corrections to be made there, and then the reports get submitted back up. Once the owner signs off at the owner level and submits forward, the tables then go to the funder level, and that is the top rung of the ladder. Once the tables go to the funder level, they can be unsubmitted for changes. Typically, we don't like to do that unless there are some critical errors, such as not having a utility allowance entered, which would affect all records. But typically, we do not like to unsubmit, because as soon as you submit 1 year's table to the funder level, the next year's table becomes available for you to input information on. And unfortunately, if we unsubmit, say, a 2015 table at this point, it would totally wipe out everything you have in for 2016. So we try not to unsubmit for that reason. And we would never unsubmit a table without talking to you first to ascertain how much information you would lose if we did an unsubmit. So keep in mind, I'm at the property manager level. I'm now seeing all my organization's projects, which means I can see some projects that if I went in, I would not have edit rights. And the easy way to see which properties those are is to scroll down my screen, and the ones where it says edit for table 1, that means I'm at least in a role. The table might not be at my level, so I might not be able to edit right now. If I wanted to get to table 1, I could quickly hit the edit button and get to that table 1. However, if I did that, I would be getting to what we call a standalone table 1, which means I could move people in, move people out, but I cannot submit from that standalone table, and I would not have access to tables 2, 3, and 4 if I just did this edit table 1. So I'm not going to go in that way. I'm going to go in what we call the long way, so I pass all the screens along the way and can explain them to you. Where I look down and I don't have an edit button, those are the extra properties that populated when I hit my organization's projects. I could go in and look, but I'm never going to be able to edit at that level. If you want to do a quick find of a property, you can use the search parameters by project name, by OID. You can use the buttons, the search parameters up here, or you can just look at the list, which is what I usually do, is just look at my list of properties. When you're looking at your list, any property where you see this green H with the circle, looks like a trademark, that means that that property has home units on it. And if you're not sure what home is, Cheryl will talk all about home in her home mini session. But For the most part, if you don't know what home is, you probably do not have home funding and do not need to worry about that. If you're not sure, when you go into WBARS, you see your property name, look for the green H. If it's there, that means you should have home units. If it's not there, like these properties, there's no home on them. Any place in the in WBARS where you see something underlined, like where these projects are underlined, that means if you click on that underlined information, it's going to pull you into another screen. It's going to pull you deeper into the system. It's the way you access other areas. So I'm going to go down and dig deeper into a property. I'm just going to go into this project, which you can see does have home units. And I'm just going to click on it. And that's going to take us to the next screen. It's always nice when you're calling a funder with questions on WBARS, if you can tell them what screen or what page you are on, you know, especially if you're asking a specific question, it really helps us to know where you are to try to figure out what you're seeing. So for example, right now I am on the project's details page. I know that because when I look at the breadcrumbs area up here, the last thing in the link says project details. So that is the page that I'm on. Justin, were there any questions on that first page before I go through the second one?
No questions so far. I'll give people a little bit of time.
Okay, so on this project details page, as we're seeing if any questions come in for the first page, I'll just start by pointing out some of the features. At the top, we have this Edit Table 1. That is the same as the Edit button on the project screen. If you click that, it'll take you to that standalone Table 1, where you'd have everyday access, but not where you want to go when it actually comes to reporting time. Notice I have a Save and Cancel buttons here. Only if you're an organization administrator will you have these buttons, because those are there because it's allowing me to make changes to things on this page. So it looks like we're clear, so I'm going to just go ahead and go down the rest of this page. Normally your property name, address would be listed here, and of course remember this is generalized information, so it looks a little strange. But you do have number of sites, number of buildings, and then number of units, so there's a nice summary there. And I'll explain what number of sites means in just a moment. Buildings is just how many buildings are at the property, and then how many units are in the system. And then I will scroll up. And then we have the project contractor or owner information. Only your funder can change the organization listed here. An organization administrator can change the actual person that's listed here. However, most of your funders are going to ask that the person who is the authorized signer for the property is the person that be listed as the ownership contact, because they want that person to be responsible for submitting the reports. As we dig deeper into looking at the tables, we will look at a new area where it requires an owner certification when the reports are submitted. So if you are an organization administrator and you've changed out the ownership contact, and then let's say the next time you go in, you notice it's been changed back, that may be because one of your funders changed it back to the authorized signer. At the Housing Finance Commission, we typically don't tend to change it back to the authorized signer, because we still require on our reports that come in the authorized signer's actual wet signature on an owner certification, but not all funders do that, and so they're wanting to see the true authorized signer here. If you, this area here would be open to an organization administrator to change the user. But again, you might want to check with your funder before you do that because we are wanting to see the actual authorized signers listed in this area. I'm going to continue to scroll up, and we have the annual report summary. I'm going to click on this for 2016, and while it's pulling up the report, if you haven't used this before and you're not using another compliance software, especially if you're manually inputting into WBARS through the year, this is an excellent tool to tell you where you are with compliance. The report, project summary report, will tell you who your funders are, at least those that are that share the WBARS system. Commerce stands for Department of Commerce. SOH is Seattle Office of Housing, and WSHFC is the Housing Finance Commission for your tax credits. You may have additional funders showing here, just depending on who your funders are at your property. Each funder will have what their set-aside requirements are in their column. And so just starting from the top, okay, so we have all the funders and they're all looking 26 units at the project, but they're only restricting 25, which means there's one unit that might be unrestricted, could be a staff unit for your other funders or just called an unrestricted unit. For the Housing Finance Commission, if you notice that your restricted units are a couple units less than the total project units, probably those units are probably for a common area unit. And if you have tax credits, you'll know that that means for full-time staff at the property who do not have to be income qualified. So this just tells you that you've got at least one unit with something that may be slightly different because it's unrestricted. Then it talks about the set-asides of the property. Notice that it has the lowest set-aside, the 30% set-aside first. There's a good reason for this because remember, you always need to do compliance to the most restrictive set-asides. You always need to fill your lower AMIs first. You need to make sure you meet those requirements and then build up from there. So once you've met all your 30s, then you look to your 50s. You've met all your 50s, then you can rent to households at 60% if you still have units that can be rented to 60% households. So in this example, all funders are looking for 15 units at 30%, and then Department of Commerce and City of Seattle are looking for 10 units at 50%. The 10 plus the 15 would be the 25 units. So even though the Commission is only looking for 8 units at 50 and would allow you to have some 60s, chances are you're not going to be able to have those 60s because if you have units at 60%, you are not going to be meeting your set-asides for the Department of Commerce and the City of Seattle. So when I look at this property and I see this last column that says occupied as of 12/31/16, please keep in mind that that column really means occupied as of the last time you updated Table 1. It says 12/31 because at the end of the year, when you submit your report, it will be the 12/31. But basically, it's the information here is as up to date as the last time you updated Table 1. So when I look here, it shows me they've got 15 at 30, they have 8 at 50, and 2 at 60. And if they've designated their units correctly, they would be out of compliance with the Department of Commerce and the City of Seattle at this point for not having enough units at 50%.
I have a question. For the funders, what does COB stand for?
COB?
City.
City of Bellingham? Yeah, sometimes figuring out the way we shorten our names is the hardest part of the process. So units at 60, again, they have the 2, but would be okay with the commission, but not with the other funders. Then we get to total common area units, number 3 here. I noticed that this property, for example, has 1 common area allowed with the commission, but we're never going to say that a common area is required, because if your common area is not rented to a staff person, then it needs to be rented to a qualified household at your highest AMI. So it could be possible that if you don't need your common area unit, you would have 1 unit at 60%, because for the other funders, that's that extra unit that's unrestricted. Number 4 is total market rate units. If at your property you have market rate units, and by that I don't mean units that don't have a rent subsidy. I mean units that are unrestricted for your other funders, and for the commission that are specifically said to be market units, which means residents don't have to be qualified. There's no restriction on the rent that can be charged. Again, for the commission, it's never going to say market units are required. Because, of course, you can always qualify more units than you need to. The next line down is total units vacant or empty. And so right now this property has 1 vacant or empty unit. The next section, number 6, these are your special needs set-asides specific to the commission and your tax credit requirements. These are not the set-asides for your other funders at all. So any area that has this plus sign, okay, that means that I can click on that plus sign and it will tell me the unit breakdown for the households that are reported in that area. So notice I just did it for large household. Those of you that have a large household set aside with the commission, you know that by definition it must be at least a 3-bedroom unit and must have 4 or more individuals. This is a really quick way to double check that your large households, that you haven't used any 1 or 2-bedroom units to meet this set aside. It's not going to tell you which unit, and it's not going to tell you how many people are in the unit, but it will just give you a quick snapshot that, oops, I used a 2-bedroom to meet the definition. And as an auditor, one of the first things I do when I look at the report is open up this area if there's large households to do that double check. So I'm going to make it shrink again so it doesn't show me that information, just so it's a little easier to look across the lines. So for the commission, this property is supposed to have 5 disabled, 5 large households, and 6 homeless. And you can see that they've met or exceeded those set-asides. The next section is about the home program, number 7. Move the page up a little. So the home section, just so you know, the commission is not a home provider, and so if you just have the Housing Finance Commission with no other funders, you're never going to have any home units, but this section will always show up. So the same with the plus sign there for expand. I can see that the city has home units on this property, and if I expand, I can see the requirements, because not only do they have to have 6 home units, but there's a breakdown by unit size of what they should have. And then so a real quick double check to see if those are being met. So you can see right off that they're short on a 1-bedroom, which makes sense because they're required to have 6, and right now they only have 5. So I'm going to, again, get rid of that expansion. So up into questions 1 through 7, that is as of 12/31 coming directly from Table 1. the questions below, 8 and 9, you'll notice right now everything says 0 as far as what they have. That's because this information comes from Table 3 inputs. And Table 2 and 3 are not typically done until Table 1 is totally complete and ready to submit. Therefore, it makes sense that none of these numbers are filled in. It doesn't mean they haven't met these set-asides, but they don't have this. It's just because it comes from Table 3 and it's not done yet, they're all showing as 0. The very last thing is number 10, and that just shows whether or not your property is an elderly project in accordance with your documents with any of the funders listed. So that gives you a great summary of where you are compliance-wise at your project. If your project is divided into separate sites, the section below that is a site summary may be important to you. If the property only has one site, such as this one, it's just basically a repeat of the section above, and you should ignore the site section and just look at the project section. If your property has more than one site, we'll see that back on the project details page. So I am just going to pause here and see if anybody has any questions about the annual summary report. Those of you that will be in this afternoon's Digging Deeper section will get into a much more complicated one where the funders are looking for different things and you really have to figure out what is the most restrictive and how compliance should be done on that property. But it looks like we have a question, Justin.
No questions so far.
Oh, okay. Then I am going to move on. So I'm going to go back to my project details page. And I'm just going to scroll down the page. We were just in annual report summary. And so I'm going to keep scrolling down. The next section is monitoring funders. You can see who your funders are. You can see their contact information. Of course, on this one, it's generalized, so it's not very helpful. But typically, contact information, phone number, and email address. And so if you wanted to email directly, you could click on their email address here, and it would set up the email for you at one touch, which is a really nice feature if you're wanting to ask one of your monitoring funders a question and you're not sure what their email address is. I'm just going to show you by clicking on the commission as an example of what you can see in this area. Sorry, my page scrolled down too fast on me. So at the top is probably the information that's going to mean the most to you. First reporting year, and then the all-important project expiration date. If you are wondering how long the commitments on your property go, in other words, how long you're going to have to be restricted and reporting on your property, here's where you find the answer. So this property is going to be reporting and restricted until 2044, quite a long ways into the future. You can also see what the set-asides are and how long those set-asides go. For the most part, the set-asides are going to go as long as the project expiration, but you may have an instance where a property has two different types of funding, such as housing trust fund plus they have home, and the dates for expiration for the individual requirements might be slightly different. If you have a tax credit property that's resyndicated, you might also come in here and see that you have certain requirements through one date, and then which would have been the end of the initial tax credit period, and then after that period's over and you're just on the resyndication, they may change a little. So you might find some useful information in this area, But for the most part, what you see here as far as set-asides is exactly what you see on the annual report summary, and you get to see it for all funders side by side at one time. So really, I recommend you go there to see set-asides and only come here if you're specifically looking for expiration times. And to navigate away, I'm going to go back to my project details page. And scroll down to pick up where we left off. And now we're at sites for project. So earlier when I said if you have multiple sites at your project, then you could have annual summary reports that would summarize for each site. So why would you have multiple sites? Typically, if you do, it's because your property is a scattered site. For example, you may have 5 buildings, but 2 of them might be in Quincy, and the other 3 might be in a neighboring town, like Ephrata. I have a property like that. And so it's split into 2 different sites by city when you look here on their WBARS reporting. You may also have a split site because you have a property where you have, let's say, 10 buildings, and 8 of the buildings serve maybe one type of population. I have one property I'm thinking of as an example where it's a farm worker property, and 8 of the buildings are tax credit serving farm workers. The other 2 buildings are more transitional, serving migrant farm workers. They don't have tax credits on them. The Department of Commerce has funded all 10 together as one project, but the Commission has only funded the 8 buildings that are the permanent tax credit. So because the funders are sharing the information, we have to have a way to split that up. So at the Commission, I can pull out what I need, but the Department of Commerce can see the project together as a whole because that's the way they're monitoring it. So if you have separate sites, it gets just a little bit more complicated because you can go into each site and set up an on-site and a property manager. So it might be different people in the roles for each of the sites. Also, when you go to submit your reports, you have to submit for each site. You can't submit for the property on a whole. So the example that I have here only has one site. So to go into that site, to get further information, I am just going to click on the site name. And that's going to take me one page deeper into the site and buildings page. And we will just work down this page and explain the features here. At the top of the page, you're going to see the placed in service date. This is important because the date that we put here is what determines which tax credit limits are going to be used on your property. If you're in a county like King County where there is only, when you pull up the income and rent limits on the Commission's website, there's only one list of limits, this doesn't mean a lot. However, if you're in a county like Thurston or Island County where when you go on the Commission's webpage and you pull up your county's income and rent limits, there are multiple charts. Well, it's the placed in service date that determines which of those charts WBARS is going to look at to apply your tax credit limits. If you don't have tax credits on your property, then the placed in service date isn't going to, well, it won't, I don't believe it would be filled in for other funders because it's not going to be that trigger point. All of the other funders besides the Commission use the current Section 8 limit charts for the year, and they don't have this multiple limit chart issue that we have with tax credits. If you have both, of course, tax credits and another funder, WBARS is going to go through and look for each resident to see which is more restrictive, i.e. lower, the applicable tax credit or the Section 8 limit, and it's going to apply it to that resident. Layer on top of that, if you have home and you designate a unit as a home unit, it will add home as the third layer or the third check to pick the lowest limit. And when we get to a resident screen, I will tell you or show you how you figure out which limit WBARS is applying to that resident. Okay, so that's the placed in service date. We do have a gross rent floor field, however, it is not active yet, as it continues to get more and more confusing with the multiple tax credit limits. As we go forward, more and more counties get multiple charts. We feel the need to make this an active field for the future. So that is the top section. And here's the section when I was talking about that ladder and who is at the on-site manager level and who is at the project property manager level. If you are an organization administrator, you have this edit button here. If you click on the edit button, if you noticed, these boxes weren't here before. So this is who's currently set up. This is if you want to make a change, you could go in here if the organization changed, or more likely, it's just someone within your organization that you're wanting to change who has access. You would do the drop down, and then you'd have a choice of user IDs that you could put into this role. If somebody was originally set up when you did their ID and their password as an on-site manager with that box checked, they will not be available in this drop down. So if I wanted to change, I could do that, and then I would hit the Save button. In the on-site manager role for this property, if you notice, there is no one set up. And that's fine. You do not have to have someone in this role. If there's only going to be one person working on the tables and doing all the editing, then they should be in this property manager role. And they would have full functionality, and you wouldn't need somebody in the on-site manager role. When we did this session live, I got the question from someone who happens to be at a small organization, and so they are the owner contact. They were in as the property manager contact, and I think they were in as the on-site. So when they went to work in a table, they started here, they passed it up to themselves, and then they passed it up again to the owner, they really wouldn't have need to have themselves in the on-site manager role. They could just start here, do their tables, pass them up to the owner role, and then yes, they do have to submit again from the owner role up to the funder role. So sometimes at small organizations, you will have to have a person in two areas, because if they're just in under the owner role and no one's in as property manager, remember the owner role can never edit. So the tables would start at owner, but you wouldn't be able to do anything. So you definitely have to have somebody in the property manager role, but maybe you don't need an on-site manager role. Totally up to you in the setup. Keep in mind that you can only have one user ID set up for each one of these roles. So what some companies have elected to do is that when they set up a user, instead of it being an individual, they will set up, I don't know, like the name of the property, let's say Sunset Meadows, and then that is their user ID, and then everybody who works on site in the office at Sunset Meadows shares that same ID and password. And that's a way that multiple people can get in and be able to edit Table 1, even though you can only put one ID in this role. Again, this is a choice for management, gives greater access, but of course reduces accountability because you're not going to be able to tell who made a change in the system. And again, if you make any changes here, you're the organization administrator, make sure you hit the Save button. I'm not going to do that since I really didn't change anything. I get a lot of questions about how to set up users and then how do they get edit rights on a property. And so I just really want to stress that it's a two-step system. Setting them up with an ID and a password is step 1. Step 2 is assigning them into one of these roles at the property. So Justin, any questions coming in on this?
Let's see. There was one question. If I want someone who had an on-site role to be in the property manager role, then I need to take them out of the on-site role, correct? Yes.
Yes, you need to take, well, you would, if you wanted to put them into property manager, they're not going to be in this drop down. If in their setup, when you did their ID and their password, you check that on-site box. So you want to go back to their user setup, uncheck that on-site manager box, save, and then when you come back into this area for each property, they should appear in your drop down and you can select them. Excellent question. And the other part of that is you have to assign them in the role for each property that you want them to have edit rights on. So unfortunately, if it's somebody who's working on 15 properties, you have to go into each property and assign them in the role. Otherwise, they will only have edit rights on the property where you list them. Okay, so I'm going to scroll down. We have this reports by year section, and that is how we're going to access all of our tables. But before I get into that section, I just wanted to point out a couple of other sections on this page. We have the tax parcel ID section. You cannot enter any information in this section, only your funders can. So we ask that you look at this, look and see if those are your tax parcel IDs, and let your funders know if the information is not there or is incorrect. On some of the tables and information that is used by the other funders, they match things up by tax parcel numbers. So if this information isn't correct, then when they pull a report, they might not get the correct properties. The next section down talks about buildings. And remember, my site that I'm looking at right now, it's one property, only has one site, and only has one building. So if I want to look at the building, I can click on the expand button, or I can click on the edit button if I think I might want to make changes. So I'm going to click the edit, and that is going to pull up the information specific to this building. I'm going to have the building address on the top. For a tax credit property, I'm going to have the building bin, which here has been generalized to just building 1, but that would be the official tax credit identifier for the building. So it would start out WA dash, have a 2-digit number, which is the year of allocation, and then another dash, and then like a 5-digit number. That would be my bin. And then if I look down, it's going to tell me all of the units in the building, their square footage, and how many bedrooms. And I can just scroll down to see all the units in this building. If you're looking at this and you notice that the information is wrong, you'll notice there is no edit button in this area. You won't be able to change the information. So if you see something's wrong, you need to let your funder know it's wrong. On a new building setup, yeah, a unit could have got put in as a 3-bedroom when it's really a 2-bedroom. After you've been in the system and have been reporting for a couple years, I know if you call me and tell me that, oh, a unit's in here as a 3, but it's really a 2. I'm going to ask you to go have somebody walk that unit and reconfirm that that is actually true, because of course you've been reporting on the unit as a 3-bedroom for maybe years now, and if it really is a 2 and we're going to change it to a 2, that involves us going back and looking at prior reports and making sure that if we put in the 2-bedroom rent limit, nobody was ever charged for overcharged for rent. So I know that's why I'm going to ask you to double check, and probably most other funders are going to want you to do that exact same thing, because it's not just a simple change out the unit size. There could be some repercussions into making that change. Then we get down to utility allowances, and we have a choice of seeing the last 2 allowances or all. So I'm going to click all just so we can see what's there. I don't know on this one that it's going to go any deeper. Nope. So it's going back to, oh yeah, I got quite a few allowances now on my screen. Probably more than I want to look at this point. Notice it goes way back, and there's several choices. So I'm going to go back to just the last 2. Hopefully I can see more all on one screen to show you at the same time. That's better. Can I get them all? I can get most all of them. So when you set up a utility allowance, effective date actually means the date you implemented the allowance. So for example, if you're using a public housing authority utility allowance chart, and they changed their utilities last, let's say in July of 2015. You wouldn't have the July 1 date here unless you actually implemented it the very time that it came out. Typically, you have 90 days to make a utility allowance effective. So in this example, if it came out in July, so they had July, August, September, and it was made effective October 1, October 1 would be here and not the July date. You want to make sure you put in the right date, because the date that you put in here and the information, WBARS is going to automatically go through your Table 1 and update the utility allowance on all the residents. And if updating the utility allowance means you had to do some rent reductions if you were at maximum rent and the utility allowances went up, if this shows too early, it may show that residents paid too much rent, because it's going to show it was implemented before you got to do your rent decreases. So that's for the effective date. You have how many bedrooms, and then we have the allowance source. Picking the source is really important. The source that you pick here needs to match the utility allowance source that's picked on the resident records. Otherwise, the system won't know or won't be able to pick the correct utility allowance. So for example, if you look at this history, you can see they started out using Public Housing Authority Section 8, then they went to S83, at least on the 2-bedroom, back to Section 8, here's another S83, owner pays all utilities, and now they're on S82. If in WBARS on a resident record, let's say a 2-bedroom, if the utility allowance source was picked as S83, it's going to start here on the new ones. It's going to go no S83, no S83, and it's going to go back here, and it's going to input a 2009 utility allowance. Probably not going to be correct. That was $69 on a 2-bedroom. The current 2-bedroom utility allowance is $65. So in this case, it's actually less, and it wouldn't cause a big issue. Most of the time, the utility allowances go up, and then it would cause an issue if you were using an old one that was too low. So be very careful about what you're picking, and then you put in your dollar amount. If you notice, these are all grayed out. This is something new that we did last year. What we were finding is when people went to put in utility allowance, they were, in a lot of cases, typing over the old allowances that were there, which was causing an issue. Let's say we only had these October ones in here. And if you typed over the top of an allowance and you put in only an October date, but somebody moved out before October and these old ones weren't here, the system would say, oh, well, before then there was no utility allowance, and they would leave the utility allowance blank on Table 1. So to prevent typing over, as soon as you submit an annual report, so in this instance when the 2015 annual report was submitted, these 2015 utility allowances were locked in and can no longer be edited. If one was incorrect and needs to be changed, or if you just have new allowances you need to put in, you click on Add Rows here. I'm going to click on that and you will see that whenever Add Rows is selected, the system automatically puts in 3 new lines for you to use. If you don't need to use all 3, fine. Fill in the ones you need. We'll go up to the top of the page, hit Save, and the additional or the extra lines will disappear. If you need more, fill these in, hit Save, hit Add Rows again, and you can get more. So when I'm talking about the utility allowance source, I'm going to hit this drop down and you can see all of the choices. Just because a choice is here does not mean it's a choice that really you should use on your property. A lot of these choices here are alternate utility allowances that would have had to have been approved by the Housing Finance Commission if you have tax credits, or by one of your other funders if you don't have tax credits. So I'm just going to go through them quick. An energy consumption model, it's an alternate utility allowance, needs prior approval before it's used. HUD-regulated properties, if you have a HUD contract on your property, you have to use this utility allowance. A HUD utility schedule model, this is an alternate utility allowance, has to be pre-approved. Local utility company estimate, it is an alternate method, however, it does not have to be pre-approved by the Commission. We do ask that you let us know if you've gotten this, and what this is it's a letter from the utility company where they've looked at your past resident usage and said, based on that usage, at our current rates, this is what your utilities should cost. The owner estimate actual usage, very involved process of looking at prior usage for residents. It's an alternate method, needs pre-approval. Owner estimate similar buildings actually has been wrapped into actual usage, and it's no longer an active choice. So in the future we'll be removing that, but there are some people that are still using it. Owner pays all, exactly what it sounds like. It means the owner pays all of the utilities. There's going to be no utility allowance. So when this choice is picked, 0 is going to be put in for the amount. Public Housing Authority. These are the most common. This is your Section 8 allowance. Easiest one to get the schedule from your housing authority, and sometimes you have to do a little math to figure out which scenario applies to your property. Notice there's 3 choices. Please do not pick 1 year and then the next year you think you have to go to 2 and then to 3 the next time it changes. The reason there are 3 choices here, we have some buildings where part of the buildings, part of the units may be all electric, but maybe this wing has gas. Maybe they have gas fireplaces over there. And so within the same building, they may have different utility allowances. That's why there are multiple choices, okay? But you should stick to using the same choice year after year unless you really have made a change in your utility allowances. Because each time you change the source setup, you have to change the source on all your resident records for it to pull the correct utility allowance. The very last one here is RD. Very similar to a HUD-regulated property. If you have USDA, RD-regulated property, you have to use the RD-approved utility allowance. So that is the utility allowance section. Whatever you've entered, if you're changing things, make sure you hit that Save button at the top. There is this comment section. It's very helpful to your funders, especially if you have a building like the one I mentioned where most of it's electric but some units have gas, that you explain to us the difference, and so we can easily see why you may have set up several different utility allowances. This property, you noticed they had owner pays all. You know, I have a couple of properties where there's a homeless set aside, and on the homeless unit only, the owner pays all the utilities, but on all the rest of the units, there's a utility allowance. It's really nice if that's explained here. So where it says owner pays all, if in the comments it says, you know, this allowance is used for homeless units. Makes it a lot easier for your funders to figure out why you set up your utility allowances the way you did. Please keep in mind if you have multiple buildings, so I didn't change anything, I'm going to hit cancel. But if you have multiple buildings, you need to set up the utility allowances for each building in the project the exact same way. I see Justin typing some answers to people. No, we're good? Okay. So I'm going to move on, and we're going to go back up to this reports by year section. And notice when you're looking at this, you can tell what level each table is at. So right now, I can look and see for 2016, all tables are at the property manager level. Since I am signed into the system as the property manager, that means I'm going to have full edit rights on all of the tables at this point. So I'm going to click on that 2016, and it's going to generate that table for me. Oops, sorry, moved up too far. There we go. So when we enter the reporting area, notice that there are what I look at as like file folder tabs, and there's a tab for each of the tables and this report cover page. Typically the default is it opens on report cover page. When you start working in the system, and you know, if you've gone into table 1 for one property, it'll recognize that, and when you come in you may open up directly to table 1. If not, you can just click on the table by the File tab to get there. But first, let's look at the report cover page. By the way, there is a way here to navigate back to that annual report summary without having to go back to the project details page to grab it. You could grab it from here. I'm going to skip that though and go down the actual report cover page. A lot of this page is a summary of what we've already seen in the system. So here I see my funders and some information about my project and my site. Here is that ownership certification that I was talking about, where some funders are making this active, that before your owner can hit submit on your tables, they need to come in here and they need to certify that they have reviewed the report and are sending in the submission. This isn't active for me because I'm in as the property manager and not the owner, so I can't actually, I'm clicking and I can't actually do anything here. This is a hard stop, so that means your owner will not be able to submit their tables if a funder has made this active. I know the City of Seattle has made this active, so your ownership will definitely have to come in here and do this certification to send in the report. I believe the other funders, like Department of Commerce and the King County, are considering making this active, and it probably will be by the time you submit your 2016 report. This next section, if you have home units, same sort of thing. Home requires that owners certify to home suitability for occupancy. Has to be done. It's a hard stop if you have home units. Moving down, we have this project update. This is the place where you can message all of your funders. So at the Housing Finance Commission, we still get hard copy reports. And a lot of you will put a cover sheet on your report, and maybe if you had a fire and it affected 3 units in the building, you would tell us about that on your report cover sheet, which is great, but realize that only goes to the commission unless you send it to your other funders as well, who tend to take their reports electronically. They won't get that same message. So if you put that message in this box, then all of your funders will be able to see that message. The rest of the page is, again, just a summary of the information contained on the pages that we walked through to get here, except for this area. Right now, it doesn't really mean anything because it all says no data found. Once reports are submitted and sent back, you will see a history here of who submitted it and when, from one level to another. So if you're a property manager and you know you've sent your tables to your owner, and you go in, or you think you've sent all your tables to your owner, and you go in and you see they're still at the owner level and they haven't made it to the funder, but you're not really sure when you sent them. You can come in here and there'd be a history of when you submitted the report forward to the owner, and then you could contact the owner and give them a gentle reminder that you sent them the table and what they need to do at this point to get that table up to the owner level. So that is the report cover page, and now we're going to move to Table 1. And it's generating for us. Here we go. When you go into Table 1, okay, under this blue bar, you've got some choices. Submit report, which of course you wouldn't do till the table was totally ready and reviewed to be submitted. Move in, that is how we're going to move a resident in. Transfer, this is the functionality for transferring a resident from one unit to another. We can print what we see on the screen, or we can do an Excel export of what we see on the screen. The Excel export is going to give you the information on the screen plus a lot more information that you've entered on the resident screen, and that is what we're going to be going through in the Digging Deeper session this afternoon. At this point, though, we're just going to rely on looking at what's on our screen. What you see on your screen is going to depend on which button is chosen in this area. Latest unit information is just going to give you who's currently in the units. Unit information year to date, I'm going to click on that, and you can see it's processing. That's going to give me information on every household that's lived in the unit the current reporting year. So in other words, if somebody lived in a unit, moved out, and a new household moved in, I won't just see the current resident, I'll see the resident that moved out and prior to the current resident moving in. I don't really have any of that activity on this table at this point to see. But when you're working on the annual report submission, you definitely want to be in this mode. This all Table 1 records, this is on this training site only. It does not exist on the live site. The area here, this is if you want to do a search by unit number or by household name. You know, this property only has 26 units. I can see all my residents at once. Really no reason to use the search bar. But if you have a property that's 400 units and it's on 6 pages, your Table 1, sometimes it's really nice just to go up and use that search bar to get to, we'll see, this goes up to unit 504. Let's say I needed to get to unit 2002. It's a lot quicker sometimes to put in the unit number and do the search than to get to the 5th page of the 6-page Table 1. This choose columns for display and export. If there are more columns that you want to see on your screen, you can click this. It will open up an area where you can select additional fields to see. You won't be able to delete some fields. There's a main set, as you can see, grayed out here. I can't uncheck those. But if I wanted to see something else, like if I wanted to see my utility allowance source, let's pick that one. If I did that and I hit apply, then that field or that column would be added to what I see on my screen. Of course, my screen is only so wide, so it's going to show it to me, but it's going to be way over to the right and, not something I can see without having to scroll. If you want to get back to the original setup, you simply uncheck that box and it will go back to the original setup. And this applies for you as a user. So if you change the setup on one property, it's going to change on all the properties until you change it back. So I've changed back. So let's start looking at what we actually see on this table. If you notice, I haven't made mention yet of any of the validations in the system. And what I mean by that is where I'm seeing these yellow triangles and these green circles. The reason for that is there are validations built in at other levels, but for the most part, they're not fully reliable. So the place where you really want to look at your validations is here on Table 1. I kind of think of the validations as a stoplight. So a red square, that's a hard stop and you're not going to be able to submit. That's a critical error. Yellow diamond means the system has identified an area where it thinks there might be an issue. There's a validation for that. There's not validations for every type of error, and just because the system pulls up a validation, it might not be active. So for example, this one I'm looking at, notice as I'm hovering, I'm seeing a recertification will be needed sometime this calendar year. Could be that this person moved out before April and one's not really going to be needed. So when you see the yellow, look at the validations, see if it's something that's really a critical issue that you need to take care of. It might be something that you want to add a comment on the resident screen to explain before you do your submission. A green circle means, well, I used to say green means go, that everything's good. But that's not exactly correct. Green means the system has not found a validation that it's pointing out where there might be an issue. Doesn't mean there's not an issue, because not every form of non-compliance that could be out there is set up as a validation. So just keep those in mind. They're a snapshot. If it's yellow, take a look at it. If it's red, you're not going to be able to submit, so you're definitely going to have to do something to it. Okay? Then we have just building, unit, our residence, move-in date, last cert, move out. Is the unit vacant? If it is, you'll see a yes. Notice you also see this highlight here. The system will automatically highlight as well as validate it for certain instances. If in the vacant column you have a highlight, that tells you a unit was vacant for 90 days or longer. In the tax credit realm, that means that you would need to submit an extended vacancy rent ready report to us explaining that. All of your other funders are going to want an explanation as well. You could use the comment section for the unit in WBARS, or you could simply share your extended vacancy rent ready report that you do for the commission if you have tax credits with your other funders. You can simply send that to them, and that way they get the explanation as well. Then we have AMI, maximum income, the actual household's income, and notice some are bolded here. A bold means the income is over the limit. A bold and highlight means the income is over the limit by 140% or more. In the tax credit realm, that 140% has certain triggers, and that's why the additional highlight is there. If you do not have tax credits on your unit, just think of the bold means that they're over, and the bold and a highlight means they're really over, even a higher amount. Maximum allowed rent, and then if comments have been entered for the resident. So we're going to go and check out some of the functionality. I'm going to click on a resident just so we can go in and see what is going to be on their individual screen. Notice I'm getting in there just by clicking on the resident's name. And that pulls up the resident record. And I have an edit key here, which tells me I can do edits on this property. Notice I also have a validation that a recert will be needed. And that makes sense because no 2016 information has actually been entered for this Table 1. So I'm going to go ahead and click Edit, and that's going to open up some information so I can do some processing. If you noticed when we looked at that Table 1, there was a move-in key and a transfer key. There was no move-out key and there was no recert key, okay? So let's go through and process a recert for this household and a move-out, because you do those things actually in an active resident record. You want to be very careful that you don't process a move-in or a transfer this way. If you go in and type over a current resident information that's already here, replacing the old resident with the new, the old resident is going to disappear because you just typed over them. You never want to process that way. You always want to move somebody out, get the unit vacant, and then process a move-in. Otherwise, you'll have disappearing residents, and that's never a good thing, especially if you type over a resident that lived there all year, move somebody new in October by typing over, it'll look like the unit was vacant all the year until the October move-in. So let's go through on this one, though, because it is a recert and a move-out. We do process just by editing the resident's information. So I'm just going to start at the top of the screen. We have the building ID, the unit number. Notice those aren't accessible to me. Those are locked in, as our number of bedrooms and the square footage. Unit designation, I'm going to click this drop down so you can see the choices. CAU is from the tax credit world, meaning common area unit for maintenance, manager, or security. You'd only use that on a tax credit property if you were allowed to have common area units. If the unit is market rate or unrestricted, you want the market rate choice. But 99% of the time or more, you're going to be using this last one, which is restricted. So that's what I picked here. If this unit is a home unit, you designate that by clicking this home box. I'm going to uncheck the box for a moment so you can see right now I have additional home questions. If I uncheck that box, those questions aren't there. So those of you that don't have home, if I click this box and you're like, what are those other boxes for? Don't worry about it. If it's not a home unit, you will not have those boxes, okay? And Cheryl's going to explain those boxes in her home mini session, so I'm not going to go over them. I'm just going to say it's not a home unit, so we can bypass that. The next section is household information. Typically, you'd have your resident name here. Their move-in date, you notice, is locked in. Then we have this 2016 certification date and 2015 cert date. Notice in the 2016 box, there's a 2015. And in the 2015 box, there's a 2014. Because what these boxes really are is current cert and prior cert. until a 2016 is issued, this 2015 date is going to be here. So to process a recert, what you need to do is go up to this 2015 date. I'm going to assume the day is going to be the same and just make it a 2016. And go down to the 2015 box, delete that 14 date to show that the last one was done in 2015. Okay? Then at that point, you're ready to go down and update for this 2016 recert. Tax credit special needs, currently this unit does not qualify for a special need, but if you needed to choose one, you choose the drop down and pick the applicable special need. The move-in household size you notice is locked in as 2. The current household size I have access to. So let's say a roommate joined this household and now we have 3. So I can easily update that. I can click down to the next field, or I can hit enter or tab to get to the next place. Does a little refresh there. And these next 2 sections, these are household demographic sections for reporting that we have to do at the Commission to HUD. I am not going to open up these sections. They're pretty self-explanatory, and we ask that you put the information in there at move-in, and then you don't need to update it in the future. So I'm going to skip down to household income. When this household moved in, they were a 30% unit. At recert, they may stay a 30, or if you're adjusting their AMI, you could click on the drop-down and pick the applicable AMI. Please note that just because an AMI is there does not mean, of course, that it is a choice that should be made at your property. If you don't have units set aside at 40%, then you don't want to pick the 40% set aside, for example. I'm going to leave this household as a 30% for this example. Then we have move-in household income, can't change it. Current income. So what's in here is what was the 2015 cert. So I'm going to put in the 2016 cert. Let's say they got that new roommate and that roommate had some income, and so now they're at 43. Income's gone up quite a bit. Notice when I put that 43 in there, I got this yellow diamond. And I got that diamond because this household's now over income. Here's the income limit, and if I hover on it, it will tell me where this limit's coming from, if you can read the hover box. In the hover box, and it disappears when you're there for a while, so you might have to navigate back. The first thing, effective date, that's what cert it's looking at. The year, that's telling you what applicable table it's looking at. And then it says RUP 30%, so it's looking at the 30% limit. And the last thing there, the limit pool, is probably the most determinant factor for you. If it says TC MTSP, like this one does, or TC HERA, that means it's using the tax credit limit. If it says multifamily, that means it's using the Section 8 limit that's used by all other funders besides the Commission. Remember, WBARS will look at both sets of limits and apply the most restrictive limit here. So this one's telling us it's the tax credit limit. Then it goes on to calculate up automatically what this annual income equates to on a monthly amount, and where that would actually put them in the area median income scale. This is another demographic field, and that takes us down to the rent data. Resident rent payment, if that changed, let's say their rent went up to $500. Okay, so I'm going to change this to $500. Okay, the utility allowance here, notice I can't change that number because it's derived by which source is picked. That's what I was talking about on the utility allowance setup, about the sources needing to match. in order for the system to put in the right allowance. Now, if you've only ever set up one utility allowance source, it'll be really easy because when you do this drop down, only that one will appear. If you remember, when I looked at utility setup for this property in the past, they had made several choices. And that's why those 4 choices are listed here. Makes it a little bit more complicated. You have to know which one is the current source that you're using so that you pick the correct source and get the correct utility allowance number to populate. The system automatically adds up and gets to a total. If that's over the limit, you'd see a yellow here. For the maximum allowed rent, same as with the income maximum. If you hover, you can see what chart it's pulling from. If a household has subsidy, you need to put in the subsidy dollar amount and you need to put in the primary subsidy source. Notice there's a drop down with a list of choices. We ask that you please do not use the subsidy type HUD Section 8 agency-based. This is a subsidy type that we are going to eliminate in the future, and if you have it selected on a unit, it's going to create an error. So please make sure that this year you're not using this on any of your records, so when we delete it next year, you don't get errors. Okay? If you have questions about which subsidy source you should use, the most common are HUD Section 8 project-based or tenant-based. A tenant-based is a voucher. Or you may be using, Shelter Plus Care, or maybe one of the other USDA, this would be RD assistance. The other ones that are here are, specifically you would have that type of funding at your property with one of your funders, and then if you do, you want to make sure you select the corresponding subsidy type so that they can see the correlation between the two. If you're not sure which one you should pick, and you have a funder that has, maybe you have VASH vouchers and you're not sure, I suggest that you contact that funder directly and ask them to further explain the differences in here. Okay, so I've updated this resident, put in their recert. I could hit save and that would save the recert. While I'm here, though, to save time, I'm also going to process a move-out for this resident. And processing a move-out is as simple as coming in here and typing a move-out date. So let's say they moved out 5/31/16. I put in that date, I hit save, and that will process the move-out.
So we have a question. What if they get rapid rehousing?
Cheryl, rapid rehousing, any?
If the source for the rapid rehousing subsidy can't be captured by one of the available drop-down options, then you can use the other option, which I don't think shows in our testing website, but the typical website does have an other option. But if you're using the other subsidy option, we'll want to see a comment clarifying what that rental subsidy is. So it could be Housing Essential Needs Program or some sort of other local or county rapid rehousing subsidy source.
And I have one more question. For your current annual gross income example, is that an estimate as of 4/1/2016, or is it an estimate for the 2016 calendar year? Our clients' incomes often change month to month, so we have some confusion on the annual income estimations to report.
So for purposes of WBARS, funders are only looking for you to report on the annual certification of income that you complete one time a year. We acknowledge that many types of programs use special or interim certifications of income in cases where the rent calculation is based on the tenant's income. Please do not report interim or special reviews of income in WBARS. We only want you to report the date and the annual gross income for the annual certification of income that you complete.
Okay, so I do have this move out date in here. I haven't hit save yet. I'm going to go ahead and do that, and I'm actually saving both the recert and the move out at the same time. I do want to point out that if you have not been entering through the year, and now you find yourself at the position like this table one is, where all 2016 activity has to be entered and it's being entered manually, you want to make sure that when you're updating WBARS, you do it in this order. Please process all of your recerts first. Then once you've processed your recerts, go in and process your move-outs, and then your move-ins and your transfers. The reason I say that is, once you've moved somebody out, you can still go in and put in a recert that was done prior to their move-out date, but it's very likely that you may forget to do that. You can't move anybody in unless a unit is vacant. Therefore, you have to process your move-outs before you can process your move-ins and your transfers. So that's why you want to go recerts first, then move-outs, then you can do your move-ins and your transfers. So when I hit save on this one, notice up here it says save successfully. You will either get that message, you could get that message with some red information underneath it. It might be pointing out an issue that it would like you to look at. And you may notice as well, there's no red, but I do have a validation here because now this household's income has gone up quite a bit, okay? And again, if you look at that validation and you say, yes, they're over income, but they moved in way back in 2010, is it acceptable for them to be over income 6 years later? And the answer is yes. And so you may have this validation, look at it, acknowledge it, but no, there's not really anything you need to do with it at this point in time. There may be a rent adjustment that might be called for that we'll go through this afternoon in the Digging Deeper section. So to get back to my table one, I'm going to navigate back by clicking in my breadcrumbs. And then I'm back at my table one. This is the household that notice I processed a recert and I processed a move out. So now say I want to process a move in. Well, I have a move in button, so that's the way that I would want to do that. When I hit that move in button, it's only going to allow me to move somebody in again to a vacant unit. So when I come here and I select my building, okay, well, there's only one building at this property, only one choice. When I go to select the unit, I only have 2 vacant units to choose from. I'm going to choose that unit 201 where I just moved somebody out in May. I'm going to pick that to put in the next move-in. So I could go in 201. It's going to be a restricted unit. I would go through, enter all the move-in information in those fields that we just covered. The difference is, of course, since it's a move-in, now all those move-in fields, such as this move-in household size, are available to me. Once the table for the move-in year has been submitted, that is when those get locked. So if you put in an incorrect move-in day, as long as you're still within that reporting year, you can go back and change it until the report's submitted. Now, I'm not going to go through and process this whole thing just for the sake of time. I'm just going to hit cancel here, but hopefully you can see how the process works. The other process I want to show you is the transfer process. And here we're refreshed, and I have a transfer key, much like the move-in key, except there's some additional fields. The first thing it's going to ask me is transferring from, and it's looking for an effective date. So I'm going to say the person in unit 202 is going to transfer to unit 303. So when did that transfer take place? Let's say it took place on 10/1/16. And if I'm transferring the person in unit 202, notice they already have a 2016 recert processed. which is what we want in this case. You always want to process the research, remember, before you do the transfer. And it's saying, okay, where are you transferring from? Thinking for a moment. Thinking longer than the live site typically will. Okay, and so I'm going to transfer that person from 202. Notice when it was doing that initial thinking there, when I put in the date of that they moved out of one unit, it automatically in this transfer to, not quite sure if you can see it as it's thinking again, here we go, that it transferred them into their new unit the very next day. The system will automatically do this. You cannot have the same household in 2 different units on the same day. If you are importing and your system allows for that, when you try to import that transfer, you will have error messages and the residents will not show in the new unit because that transfer is not going to process with them being in 2 units on the same day. Then we go to where they're going. I only have 2 choices because there's only 2 vacants. I'm going to pick unit 303. And then there's going to be a place for me to enter a comment. Typically, I don't need to enter a comment because WBARS will automatically add a comment to both the unit that they're moving from and the unit that they're moving to regarding the transfer. A comment here would be if it were additional information. For example, if this person moved out on 10/1, but due to a rehab or I don't know, fire, had to go to a hotel for a week and then only came to this unit, let's say like on the 7th, if you change these dates so it's not one right after the other and you try to save this transfer, it will not let you save without putting in some type of comment. The system is not going to know whether or not your comment makes sense. It's just going to look for a comment. Here we go, see the red. I can type in whatever I want, like test, and hit OK. And it will go ahead and process, even though we would want more of a comment than what I just typed in there. Oh, and it kicked out my moving to for some reason. Let me put that in there. And it's thinking. And okay, doesn't find any issues this time. So it processes. What it immediately does is take the residence information from 202 and copy it into the new unit. Their old information is still in unit 202, and notice it shows me that that 5/1/2016 research was done, and in the new unit it copied all the information over. It does send me to this page, has this automatic recording of the transfer. This recording of the transfer will also be on the old unit. If when you transfer households, you do a new cert and fully requalify them, no problem. You would just hit edit here and you would go in and put the new certification date that you're doing. You would also go down here in the comments field and notice I have my test there. You would go down in the comments field and you would just put down that the household was fully requalified at the time of move-in. If you simply transfer the cert with them, May remains the recert month. If you do a new cert, so you have a 10/7/2016 cert at the time that they transfer, in the future they will be an October annual certification because you've totally requalified them. And I'm going to maneuver back to my table 1. So hopefully you've seen how we do a recert, a move out, process a move in, and process a transfer. The Excel export we will get to in our Digging Deeper section later this afternoon, because once you have a table totally ready to submit, you're going to want to do that Excel export and check for errors before you hit the submit button. However, if you have to do tables 2 and 3 for your other funders, you don't want to submit yet. Once you have table 1 totally ready to go, you're then going to move to table 2 and process through there before you do the submit process. So as this is getting to table 2, we're going to transfer to Cheryl, who's going to tell you how to do this table.
Hello, so if you could just hang with us for a few more minutes, and then we'll go ahead and take a break between now and the home mini session. As Lanike mentioned, please do not start working on table 2 and 3 until absolutely everything is completed on table 1. You want to make sure that all households who resided in the property during the calendar year are reflected on table 1, and that you've reviewed table 1 to make sure that you haven't missed anybody or missed any errors. Another thing to look for is to make sure that the unit designations you reported on table 1, restricted, market, common area, etc., are accurate, because that data impacts the data on table 2. So you'll see at the top of the table there lists some validation issues, and we're going to ignore those for now. But when you complete the table and save it, you want to go back up and check these validation issues to see if anything wonky is going on. So this first section is pretty self-explanatory, and the system even gives you a good hint right here. It says total number of restricted units, 26. So if we edit here, and assuming that what we've reported on table 1 is accurate, we can put in 26 right here. And you'll notice that I'm putting it in renter restricted units, not the owner column. It's exceedingly rare that you would report restricted owner units. This is in cases, for example, of manufactured mobile home parks where owners are actually residing in the affordable unit that they own. So if you have questions about that, talk with your funder, but the vast majority of you will be reporting restricted renter units. So we're going to hit save. Still processing. Oh, I'm going to ignore the validations for now until we go through the rest of it. And my apologies, it takes a little longer in this system. The second one is this occupancy, and this automatically pulls from table 1. So if you've completed table 1 accurately, there's nothing that needs to happen here. And likewise with section 3, this is pulling directly from table 1 based on the household size. So individual households, household size of 1, any households 2 or more will be reported as family households. Family in this context does not mean necessarily families with children under the age of 18. This next section is the race and ethnicity section for your restricted units only. And I understand that if you have tax credit funding, you are reporting on some race and ethnicity on table 1. Also, if you have home funding, you're reporting race and ethnicity for home households in home-funded units on table 1. But not all funders use those tables, and many funders require this table to show the race and ethnicity of all of the restricted the households in restricted units for the calendar year. This is a cumulative table, so it should show all households during the year, not those just still in occupancy at year end. So the first column here, head of household by race, you're reporting for just the one head of household. So you could have, say, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5. Now we've got 25. So what about Hispanic ethnicity? For this system, Hispanic or Latino ethnicity is a subset of race. So, for example, you may have a household who discloses that they are of white or Caucasian ethnicity, but they're also Hispanic. And in that case, you would report the household here. Or you could have cases where a household may not report a race at all, but only report Hispanic ethnicity. And in that case, you would report them as race not disclosed with Hispanic ethnicity. One of the main confusions is that there's a thought that this column here, 25, needs to also be 25 in this column. And again, since it's a subset, that isn't the case. So you wouldn't want, for example, to put in a 24 here just to get a 25 tally. Any questions on race or ethnicity? All right. If you have a property management software system, perhaps it would be easiest if your system has a race ethnicity report to just run it for year end, and that could certainly make it easy for you to complete this table. If you don't have that sort of software, just keeping a simple Excel spreadsheet to tally through the year is helpful. And keep in mind that good practice is to ask residents to fill out a race ethnicity special needs form after they've moved in. Just to avoid any potential concerns around fair housing, it's good practice to get this information after the household's moved in. It's not required, but we do want to see that you're at least asking your residents to complete it. So if, for example, we received a report and all 25 households were not disclosed, we may ask, did you ask the households to attempt to gather the information, or did you just not make that effort? And so we do really want to see everyone make an effort to gather this documentation, and it is required in many contracts. Certainly, it's a required component for City of Seattle loan agreement contractual obligations. This is information that the city and many other funders also use on a regular basis. There's a lot of discussion these days around affirmative marketing and fair housing. And so we do, as funders, run reports to look at the race and ethnicity of households served in our affordable housing portfolios. And it's something good to keep an eye on as you're completing this. You might have a property where, say, a vast majority of your tenant population is all one race, and you may want to do some thought process as to why and consider affirmative marketing to reach out to those who may be least likely to apply. So I'm not going to hit save here, but because I don't want the system validations to pop up again, and the testing site's a little slow. But when you're doing this in the real site, I would recommend saving frequently, because if you miss hitting save, all your information is going to be wiped out. This next section, section 5, is also automatically populated from table 1. Oh, hold on, we have a question.
Okay, so I have 2 questions actually. So the first one, does the total head of household counted always equal the total households served?
It should, and you'll get a green validation. So you're going to report race for the head of household for every household that lived in a restricted unit. So therefore, it should match the number of households served in restricted units.
And the next question, what is a good way to tally the race and ethnicity?
I mean, a good way to tally, when I was working in property management, if I didn't have a software system that did it for me, I would, there are HUD forms that have this race ethnicity data on it, or you could create your own form, give it to the tenant as part of their move and ask them to complete it and bring it back, and then just create a simple Excel spreadsheet that looks exactly like this, and you can just tally it up during the year, and then you'll have it all ready to go when you're ready to do the report. Any other questions, Justin?
That's it so far.
Okay. Restricted unit household income, this pulls directly from table 1 from that actual percent AMI column. And this is really fascinating information for us as funders. We look at this at City of Seattle regularly. For example, we run a report every year that looks at the restricted income class of units that we funded, so the number of 30%, 50, 60% units that we funded, and we compare that with the actual income of the households being served in those units. And consistently for many years in the City of Seattle, although we have units that are throughout the income spectrum, approximately 75% of the households actually served in the units are a 30% AMI or below. So that really demonstrates the need of affordable housing at lower AMI levels, at least in the Seattle area. Section 6 is total restricted unit households, and this is single mothers and single fathers with children. If you have this data, we'd love to see it. If you don't have it, I know in the city it's not outright required, but please do report on it if you have it. And the very last is renter households and restricted units served during the year. And so this is another kind of easy no-brainer one where it gives you the answer right there. So then that's assuming you completed Table 1 correctly. So let's put in 25. And now I'm going to save and see if we got rid of some validations here. All right, so I'm seeing green, 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 and save successfully. So we're all good to go. Any questions about Table 2 before I move on to Table 3? All right, moving on to Table 3, and then we'll break for coffee or whatever you need to keep going for your day. Table 3 is a simple, there's two sections, special needs and homeless households. The special needs section, you'll see on this project there's a yellow diamond for persons living with HIV or AIDS. That indicates that this property has a contractual requirement for one or more funders to serve households in that special needs category. So at a minimum, you must report that you're meeting your minimum set-aside requirements. In addition, if you know that you're serving households that meet one of these criteria, let us know. Absolutely report what's required, but we get a lot of questions from our elected officials and policymakers about, you know, how many domestic violence survivors are being served, or especially how many veterans. We get this question a lot. So if you're serving veterans, tell us about it. We have, you know, a homeless veteran crisis and a homeless crisis in general, and if you're serving special needs populations, take credit and let us know. So again, this is, you only want to report the household in one category, so if there are multiple special needs, you can report here and then provide a description. So perhaps this household, head of household is elderly and developmentally disabled. And so we'll go ahead and save. This total does not need to match the total number of restricted households. It's a subset. It may match, but it may not. The second section, homeless households. Again, this property has a contract requirement to serve homeless, as you can see by the yellow diamond. So at minimum, tell us who you're serving. Family, so let's say for this, let's say they serve 25. And seems like this will meet the contract requirement. Individual, one-person household, family, two or more. If you have contracts that require homeless families with children under the age of 18, please report those in the family category. And then include any comments. If things don't match up, for example, maybe you received a waiver from one of your funders on one of your homeless designated units to use that unit to provide a reasonable accommodation or some other need that wasn't necessarily homeless, give us a comment here to explain the situation and why it's not matching. Any questions on special needs or homeless reporting? All right. We're going to hang out here for just a couple more minutes, and we're going to go to the PowerPoint before we go. There we go. So the 2015 webinar, the one we did last year, is already posted on the Finance Commission website, and we'll also be posting the 2016 webinar that we're doing this very moment after we get it edited. And we'll be also hosting a training on tables 4, 4A, 4B, and a new table 5, which we'll talk about later in the spring. For technical assistance, you can contact me at the City of Seattle Office of Housing, Cheryl Cohen, and there's my contact information. For King County questions, if you have King County contracts, please contact Wendy DeRabio. And for State Commerce, Tyree would be your contact. And for the Finance Commission, your assigned portfolio analyst, which you can see based on who's listed in WebARS for your property.
And someone has requested that you go back to the training resources tab or slide.
This one here. So there's the link. So it's www.wshf wbc.org/manager/WBARS.htm. And so there's a ton of information there about WebARS, the user guide, FAQ, webinars, and training materials all available right there. All right, well, I think we're going to mute, and then we'll be back at 11 o'clock for the home mini. I'm sorry, one more question?
I have a few more questions. I assume the 2016 will be posted in the same place as the 2015.
Yes, it will be posted in the same place.
It will actually take its place. The 2015 will be gone, and the 2016 it will be active.
And another question, is low market unit a restricted unit?
I'm not sure about the terminology low market unit. There's, in the home program, there's low home, which we'll talk about at 11. But units are either restricted or they're market. So a restricted unit, your affordability level, and then a market is there's no income restrictions on that unit. All right, well, I hope some of you will join us for the home session at 11 or come back at 1 o'clock for the digging deeper. But go have some lunch, and we'll see you in a little bit.